Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Service Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Daily edition dated 13 December 2022. The topics which are to be discussed have been displayed on the screen and the time stamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So our first topic has appeared at page number 6 in today's The Hindu Daily edition in the editorial section. And this topic is in the context of the recent cyclone which is named as Mandous, which has hit the eastern coast of India. This cyclone has moved through the Andaman and has made a landfall on the northern portions of the Tamil Nadu's coast and some portions of the Andhra Pradesh as well. Now, initially it was expected that this cyclone will be very rough and will develop into a severe cyclonic storm as classified by IMD, but luckily it has not been the case so. So it did not gain much strength and also it has been called as a textbook cyclone. So from this very context we get to know that what should we learn about this cyclone. For example, when we go by the UPSC scheme of syllabus, this topic finds its relevance in two main papers, GS1 as well as GS3. Because in GS1 it mentions the important geophysical phenomena such as cyclones. In GS3 it mentions the component of disaster management. And obviously we all know the cyclone is a disaster and India is very much vulnerable to the tropical cyclones. Every year we face number of cyclones. More importantly, in the backdrop of the climate change, the cyclones in the Arabian Sea are also gaining their strength and frequency. So that is why in order to reduce the losses of life and property. Now the importance of this topic can also be assessed through the regular questions which have been asked in UPSC time to time. For example, in UPSC 2014, the question was asked that tropical cyclones are largely confined to South China Sea, Bay of Bengal and Gulf of Mexico. Why? So to answer this particular question, you need to be aware about the developmental conditions which form a tropical cyclones. This section will also be dealt in detail in today's discussion. And the previous year 2013 UPSC asked another question that the recent cyclone on the east coast of India was called Felin. How are the tropical cyclones named across the world? So this question is based on the nomenclature of the tropical cyclones, that how the tropical cyclones are named across the world. So in today's session we will track the path which recent cyclone Jawad has taken. Then we will discuss the concept of the cyclone with the help of the structure which a tropical cyclone develops. Further, we will come to the nomenclature of the tropical cyclones and some examples related to this nomenclature. And in the end, we will assess the damages associated with tropical cyclones and the measures which can be taken in order to deal with such disaster. So first of all, we will assess this picture. This is the Bay of Bengal region. And because now we are facing a winter season, that means we are in a retreating monsoon phase whereby the winds move in this direction. We have northeasterly winds. For example, in this picture you have an animation of the direction of the winds in the Bay of Bengal region in present times. As you can see, the wind is coming from the northeasterly direction and is going towards the southwest. So that means the direction of the wind is northeast to the southwest. So you must have heard about the concept of the retreating monsoon which Indian mainland faces in the months of December and January. That is why in the Arabian Sea also we have the winds northeasterly in direction. So first of all, you need to understand that what exactly the cyclones are. The cyclones are the low pressure areas which are in turn created because of high intense insolation. And that is why these cyclones are primarily found in tropical regions. What happens is, suppose this is an ocean surface comprising water and the sun is directly heating the surface of these oceans. Now what happens is that the air parcel just above this area will be heated, and as we know that the warm air is lighter in nature and that is why the warm air will rise up. So now because the air from this area has risen up, this area becomes a low pressure area. And then the cause and effect relationship develops where the wind continuously rises in the upward direction from this particular area. And now, because we all know that the movement of the wind is from high pressure to low pressure, that is why this particular area will attract the winds from all the directions. Now what will happen is, suppose this is a low pressure area and it is attracting the wind from all the directions. But as you will diverge from this central location, the pressure will rise. So what will happen is, suppose this is, I am having 998 millibar of pressure, this will be 1000 millibar of pressure, and this will be 1002 millibar of pressure. So as you can see, the pressure is rising as we move outwards from this center. And that is why the winds from the outer area is converging towards this central point. And hence the pattern of the winds becomes circular in nature because the isobars are closed. As you can see here, we have a complete circle of isobars. Those who don't know that what are isobars, let me tell you that isobars are imaginary lines which join the points having equal pressure. So this means that if we are, for example, talking about this isobar, that is this line, so at every point on this particular line, we will be having the pressure of 1002 millibar. This is what is known as isobar. Similarly, at every point on this particular line, we'll be having 998 millibar of pressure. So now, because this area is having a very low pressure, the wind will rise in upward direction. And then it will be affected by the Coriolis force. We will discuss this Coriolis force later. But first, here you need to understand that the cyclones are the low pressure area having circular pattern of winds characterized by closed isobars. Now if you see this particular diagram, we have an eye in the center. The central portion of the cyclone is called as eye. And this is a rough structure of a tropical cyclone whereby the winds are rising in this direction and they are moving outwards. Now you need to understand that what are the prerequisite conditions which are necessary in order to form a full-fledged tropical cyclones. The first and the foremost condition is the warm oceans. The surface temperature of the ocean body should be greater than 27 degrees Celsius in order to act like a heat engine, because tropical cyclones act like heat engine, and that is why they require a very warm mass of water. The second important thing is that these tropical cyclones require abundant and continuous supply of moisture, and that is why these cyclones do not originate over the land. So the tropical cyclones will always be originated in the ocean body, and as soon as they will enter the landmass, they will die out. The third important condition is the Coriolis force. Basically, Coriolis is technically not a force, but it is a deflection which is caused due to movement of the earth. Now suppose this is our earth, and we all know that earth moves in this direction. The earth moves from west to east, and as the earth will move, it will deflect the moving object in some direction. Now that direction is towards the right in the northern hemisphere and towards the left in the southern hemisphere. Now if we apply this Coriolis force, let's say on this diagram, what will happen? Now because we are talking about the cyclones in Bay of Bengal that lies in the northern hemisphere region, let us understand that how the Coriolis force will change the direction of the motion of the winds in a tropical cyclone. Now suppose this is our cyclone which has originated in the Bay of Bengal, and as we have learned that the Coriolis force will deflect the moving body in right direction in the northern hemisphere, so that means that all these winds will be deflected towards their right, which means this will be deflected in this direction, this wind will be deflected towards this will be deflected towards this in this fashion. So all the incoming wind towards the central point will be deflected towards their own right. And if you closely observe this phenomena, the overall direction which you are getting for the wind is in this direction. And this is anti-clockwise motion. That is why we say that tropical cyclones move in anti-clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere. And as you can also observe that Coriolis force is the sole force which will be responsible for the rotating winds. And we know that in cyclones, the winds are rotating in nature. That is why the Coriolis force is one of the conditions in order to form cyclones. If there are no Coriolis force, there will be no rotation and there will be no cyclone. And the last important condition is the upper divergence. Now if you again closely look this diagram, this is the low pressure region. And here the wind were converging as we have discussed. But from this area, as soon as the wind is rising in the upper atmosphere, it is diverging from this central point. That is why we say that the upper air divergence is also essential, because this upper air divergence will in turn lead to pressure differences in this region and this region. And this pressure difference will in turn energize the cyclone, because this will be responsible for the movement of wind in the vertical frame. Now coming to the important characteristics of tropical cyclones. The first characteristic we have already discussed, that they move anti-clockwise in northern hemisphere and vice versa, that is clockwise in the southern hemisphere. The second, we have also discussed that these cyclones die on reaching the land surface, because these cyclones require continuous supply of moisture, and once they reach the land topography, which is dry in nature, that continuous supply of moisture is being cut and the tropical cyclones do not get the required energy in order to sustain themselves. That is why they die on land. And the third peculiar characteristic which is relevant in the context of India is that the frequency and intensity of the cyclones in Bay of Bengal is higher than the Arabian Sea. On an average, it is estimated that the ratio is 4:1. That is, in 1 year, Bay of Bengal experiences around 4 cyclones and Arabian Sea experiences 1 cyclone. However, you might have read that in recent times, because of the climate change, this difference is getting lowered and the frequency as well as the intensity of the cyclones originating in the Arabian Sea are also rising. Now we will move on towards the IMD classification which it has made in order to classify the tropical cyclones on the basis of the wind speed. Now IMD classifies tropical cyclones in 6 categories, ranging from the low pressure disturbance to the super cyclone. The wind speed in the low pressure region is less than 31 km per hour. However, the wind speed in a full developed mature super cyclone crosses 221 km per hour. Now, as far as this Jawad cyclone is concerned, it is as of now classified as deep depression, that is DD. Now we come to the naming of these tropical cyclones, that what procedure is adopted while naming these tropical cyclones and which body is responsible for their naming. So this nomenclature is set on the specified criteria and procedures which we are going to discuss now. Now across the world, various regions are divided under regional specified meteorological centers, that is RSMCs, and the tropical cyclone warning centers, that is TCWC. So across the world there are 6 RSMCs and 5 TCWCs. Out of the global 6 RSMC, the one RSMC is the Indian Meteorological Department, which is the overall body in the context of cyclones, especially in the Indian Ocean region. And that is why the IMD names the cyclones developing over the North Indian Ocean, including the Bay of Bengal as well as the Arabian Sea. Now there are 13 countries in this specific region and each country has provided 13 names. So that means total we already have 169 names of tropical cyclones. So whenever a cyclone originates in the North Indian Ocean region, the name is given on the basis of this list sequentially. For example, if the cyclone is named as A, then the next cyclone will be named as B, then the next cyclone will be named as C. We will look at some of the names of these cyclones which are there in the list later. However, the countries are not absolutely free to decide whatever name they want. There are specific guidelines in order to ensure that these names are neutral in nature. So now let us look at the guidelines. First, it says that the proposed name should be neutral to politics and political figures, religious beliefs, cultures, and gender. Second, it says in line with the first statement only that the name should be chosen in such a way that it does not hurt the sentiments of any group of population over the globe. It should not be rude or cruel in nature. It should be short and easy to pronounce and should not be offensive to any member. And because the name is to be short, the maximum length of the name will be 8 letters. This is done in order to generate the awareness among masses, because earlier when there were technical names, the common masses were not able to understand the meaning of those names, and that is why it was one of the biggest obstacles in generating the awareness as well as the rescue operations in cyclonic disasters. So that is why now the guidelines have been formed in order to have a short and easy to pronounce names. Next, it says that the proposed name should be provided with its pronunciation and voice over also. And the last, it says that the names of the tropical cyclones over the North Indian Ocean will not be repeated. Once used, it will cease to be used again. Thus, every time the name should be new. Now, these are the examples of few names which are given by each country in the Indian Ocean region. For example, this Jawad, Jawad. Few years back, you might have heard about the names of cyclones Gati, Nisarga, Nivar. So this is a list which is already been provided by the countries, and name of the cyclones are kept as per this list. Now we will try to analyze the cyclone as a disaster. So this picture shows the associated damages which a tropical cyclone can create. First, it can lead to flooding of the coastal areas, it can erode the beaches, and can also lead to loss of soil fertility, because the tropical cyclones bring with itself the saline water of the oceans, and that water intrudes the land masses, which in turn increases the salinity of that particular land patch. Next, because of the high velocity and momentum of those winds, there is a huge scale damage to the existing structures like building, communication lines, infrastructure, transport arteries, etc. In similar fashion, there is a loss of power and communication. And we all know that there is a large scale loss of life and property, including the livestock. Further, the water supply system gets contaminated, and because of the excessive rain, there are chances of land subsidence and flooding of the inland area as well. So in order to minimize the loss of life and property, we need to take such measures. First, we need to have a robust early warning system in order to disseminate the information within time. Now, this early warning system is primarily built to achieve two objectives. The first is to ensure the emergency response system, and the other is to assess the impact of any tropical cyclone in order to design the rescue operations needed in that particular affected region. The second important thing is that the government and administration should ensure that the communication and dissemination of information should be smooth enough in order to provide all the relevant information as well as material to the people affected in a particular region. And that is why the network lines, that is telecommunication network lines as well as infrastructure network lines, should be strengthened, and in case they have been damaged, they should be repaired as early as possible. The third thing is that the administration should also go for the structural measures. And in this sense, saline embankments can be made, cyclone shelters can be established, and the lining of canals and the cleaning of drains can be an important step towards reducing the loss of life and property in such a scenario. Because tropical cyclones are always accompanied with high intensity rainfall. And if we have adequate number of canals, if our drains are cleaned enough, we can divert and transport the surplus water from our streets towards these canals and drains, which in turn will reduce the chances of flooding of our cities and villages. The next important thing is that there should be a specific plan for the coastal zones, because as we have discussed that tropical cyclones hit the coast and they die as soon as they reach the land. So that is why the coastal areas are most vulnerable to these tropical cyclones. And in order to prevent the shock of these tropical cyclones, mangroves, shelter belts, and floodplain management in the coastal areas is the best possible strategy to reduce the impact of these cyclones. And last but not the least is the step in context of the common masses, that is the awareness generation. So in this sense, people need to be aware and they should be provided with the basic information that what they need to do, what they don't need to do as soon as the cyclone hits their area. Because it is said that community is always the first responder in case of any emergency situation. And so is the importance of the community of that particular area which is affected by some disasters, including the tropical cyclones. Now, summing up this entire topic once again, when we analyze the structure of the tropical cyclone, whose central low pressure area is called I, and this is surrounded by the uplifting air from the circumference, and on reaching the upper atmosphere, these winds diverge. Then we discuss the concept of the cyclones, that these are the low pressure areas having circular winds, having closed isobars, and the warm oceans, abundant moisture, Coriolis force, and upper divergence is the necessary condition for the formation of tropical cyclones. Then we discuss the six-fold classification of the IMD on the basis of the wind speed of tropical cyclones and how these cyclones are technically differentiated on this basis. Then we discussed in detail about the nomenclature and the procedure followed for naming the tropical cyclones across the world, especially in the context of India, with the help of these names which are provided already by the Indian Ocean Rim countries. And in the last, we discussed the cyclone as a disaster and what potential disasters it can create, which can lead to loss of life and property, and then what measures can we take in order to reduce and minimize the damage to life and property. Now, this topic is in relation to the United Nations Security Council. The latest context of this very topic in today's The Hindu Delhi edition is that recently External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar will be visiting New York to participate in a meeting at the United Nations Security Council. The important agenda of this meeting will be to take up the reforms in the United Nations Security Council. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic is mainly important from General Studies Mains Paper 2 perspective because it mentions international relations as its important component and specifically writes the important international institutions, agencies, their structure as well as mandate. So in this very regard, what is important from the UPSC's examinations perspective is that we should be aware about the United Nations as a whole. So under today's session, we will discuss about one specific part, that is United Nations Security Council. We will discuss that what is UNSC, its structure, why UNSC reforms are needed and what are the specific areas where UNSC reforms are needed, and then we'll discuss in the end that what is the case for India's permanent membership stake at United Nations. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic falls under the General Studies Paper 2 section International Relations. So now let us begin our discussion. First of all, we must know that UNSC stands for United Nations Security Council, and this is a principal crisis management body and it has the power to issue binding obligations. Now this word is important. Binding obligations on all the members of the United Nations. It has three core roles. First is ensuring the international peace and security. Second is UNSC has its role in selection and appointment of the new members to the United Nations. It gives its recommendation to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And third is any change in the UN Charter or any modification in the UN Charter must be approved by the United Nations Security Council. And when we talk about the UNSC, the most important thing is the P5 group. Now, what is P5? We'll discuss it. UNSC has two types of members. One are the permanent members and other are the non-permanent members. Now, there are 5 permanent members which are known as P5, that is permanent 5. Now, these members, as the name signifies, are permanent in nature. China, France, Russia, UK, and USA. Now these 5 countries are permanent members, and the most special thing about permanent members are that they have a veto power. Now, veto power means that on any issue which is being debated in UNSC, these countries have the veto power. For example, let's say if country A attacks the country B and UNSC decides to sanction the country A, and just one country out of these five countries votes against this sanction, that sanction cannot be imposed on it because that particular country has vetoed it. But the problem is that this veto power is only available to these five countries. The next are the non-permanent members, which are 10 in number and they are appointed on rotation basis, giving adequate representation on geographical terms. That means all the continents will be given adequate representation. But this geographical representation is restricted only to the non-permanent membership and not to the permanent membership. Now, there are certain issues and challenges in which UN is lacking, and that is why we need reforms in certain areas. Now, first of all, if you closely analyze that these are the five permanent members, and out of these, just look USA, UK, and Russia, and the erstwhile, which was known as Soviet Union in the post World War II era, were the major powers. And that is why this permanent membership symbolizes the World War II period, post World War II period. And that is why there is a power disbalance among these five countries and the other complete world. But now, if we talk about the present situation, that geopolitical situation has changed a lot. Now, country like India is emerging with its full might. Now, there is a huge socio-economic and cultural importance of the countries of Africa. For example, Japan is one of the most industrialized nations of not only Asia but of the whole world. Similarly, Brazil has also its importance at the global geopolitical level. So the point is that presently the geopolitical situation has changed a lot since World War II, and that is why there must be a reform and UN must do away with this restricted five permanent member formula. The second important thing is that if you closely again understand this membership, only one country, that is China, is from Asia, right? So there is inequitable representation. Europe is overrepresented because Europe as a continent is very small and it supports a very minuscule share of world population. But if you see the countries, we have France and UK from Europe. Then Asia, we have discussed, is underrepresented because Asia is a very huge continent, but we have just one representative, that is China. And Africa and South America, so large continents, but they have zero representation. The third major issue is of legitimacy and credibility, the latest example being the Russian-Ukraine war. In the past also there have been several invasions, for example in Libya, in Egypt, in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. So there have been continuous invasions going on across the world, but UNSC has failed to stop those invasions and take the necessary steps. That is why in present times UNSC face the crisis of legitimacy and credibility. The north-south divide is the continuation of this very issue, because if you divide the world into two halves, that is north and south, most of the countries, for example China, France, Russia, UK and USA, all these countries are in the north. Then the latest issue is that present times are witnessing the emerging new issues to which UNSC is completely new. For example, in present times, due to globalization, economic interdependence is rising. Environmental degradation has become one of the most widespread threatening phenomena for the entire humanity. And moreover, the transnational threats, for example, terrorism, is becoming highly modified. Now we have cyber attacks. Now the organized crime is becoming high tech. So presently UNSC is not able to cater all these emerging issues. And the last issue is the relationship between the Security Council and General Assembly of the United Nations. There have been a lack of coordination and continuous friction among these two parts. So these are the broader reforms which are needed in UNSC. Now we will discuss the case for India's permanent membership because India is one of the torchbearer to reform the UNSC. So whenever we have to discuss the case for some country, we must look the geopolitical significance of that particular country. And that is why we will analyze the geopolitical significance of India also in this regard. First of all, India has around one-sixth of the global population. That means the demographic power is huge with India. Second is India is the largest democracy of the world, and that is why it is believed that India's entry into UNSC will provide UNSC with the required democratic values. For example, we all are aware about the hardcore geopolitical stance of countries like USA, Russia, and China. If India enters into the permanent five grouping, then it is believed that India will stand for those countries who are not very strong and thereby will put their democratic principles and values into UNSC. Next comes the economic might. Now, factually, India was the fifth largest economy in 2019, and as far as the purchasing power parity is concerned, India ranks third globally. So that means that India is among the top five economic powers. Now come military. India is a responsible nuclear power, being the third largest military spender and one of the largest standing armies. Further, India's contribution to the United Nations is also very huge. India is the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping operations, which majorly is deployed in the countries of Africa. So that means that India's contribution to United Nations is also very huge. First, at the geopolitical scale also, the latest example again being the Russian-Ukrainian war. India has active participation in the global geopolitics. Further, India is also one of the four members. The grouping is known as G4 members. India is a member along with Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And the major goal of G4 grouping is to reform the United Nations Security Council, and all these countries support each other's bid for the permanent membership in the UNSC. Now let us take up a next topic. This topic is in relation to the suicide which has been committed by three students in the city of Kota in Rajasthan. Now you might think that this topic is not as such relevant from the UPSC's perspective because this is very localized news, or rather you can think that this topic is important because suicide is an important public health issue which is emerging in India these days. So yes, we can read this particular issue from the social justice perspective. But in today's session, we are going to discuss this topic in a different dimension. And that different dimension is ethics. Because it has been found that in recent years in the ethics paper, several case studies have been asked which have the relevance from the current context. The important news of the current affairs become the important case studies for you people as far as the ethics paper is concerned. So that is why we are going to discuss this particular news from the ethical perspective. And as we all know that the most important part of all this ethical analysis of any issue is that we should be able to identify that what are the various ethical issues which are involved in a particular case study. So this news is all about that recently three students who were preparing for the competitive examination died by suicide. They were found hanging from ceiling fans in their rooms and they were preparing for the NEET examination. So now this is a very problematic situation that the students who are preparing for the competitive examination they are not able to bear the burden of that competition. So this poses several ethical issues. The first and the foremost ethical issue is means versus end. Now you think yourself that for you what is education? Is the education a means to achieve something? That might be the post for which you are preparing, that might be the salary, that might be a very good working environment, that might be the life security, that might be a better partner, or that education is end in itself. That education is not a mean to achieve certain thing, but acquiring the education is the end in itself. if I am getting educated, if I am learning something, that is my only objective. Yes, I can utilize it for my benefit in the coming times, but there is a difference in perspective. So, whenever education becomes the means to achieve certain things, and in any case, if we are not able to achieve that particular thing, then we think that our whole education is just a waste. For example, if I got a degree from a college and still I am not able to get a job, then we tend to think that what is the use of such education? So yes, obviously one must get job, but then there is a different perspective also, that you have gained some knowledge, you have gained some information, you have gained some experience. Okay, so first ethical issue is that what do you treat education as a means or as an end? The second ethical issue is the social pressure, that the children, the students who are preparing for certain competitive examination, for example, in this particular news, many a times it happens that they are doing it under the peer pressure, under the pressure of their family, relatives, friends, or a larger society. Why do I want to become an IAS officer? Just because last year my friend got selected, and now everyone in my family, in my society is just giving his example to me. So this automatically will build a pressure on me that okay, I must also clear this prestigious examination just to prove my worth. But under such pressures, I may buckle down, and then I can lead to certain such extreme steps as well. The third ethical issue involved is that in the recent education ecosystem, we are ignoring or rather neglecting the ethical values, moral values in our education. As we discussed in this very point, means versus end, the end of the education is generally viewed as to produce the skilled labor force. And this is one of those points also which we write in our answers as well. For example, if I ask you that what are the various challenges in our education system, we tend to come up with this point that our education ecosystem is not able to produce skilled labor force. Yes, that is a challenge, but somehow we tend to forget, is our education producing good human beings? Whether our education ecosystem is able to inculcate moral and civil values in our students? So, this is something which requires a good thought. Next issue is the ignorance towards the genuine issues of mental health. Still, in our society, mental health is considered as a taboo. Whenever we get a common cold, we go to doctor. Whenever we find some headache or some back pain, we refer to the doctors. But whenever there is some mental or psychological issues, we tend to think that there is no requirement to consult any doctor or psychiatrist. So here lies a big challenge. And moreover, if we have to discuss from the public health ecosystems perspective, in India there are just zero point 0.3 psychiatrists per 1 lakh populations. And the WHO's recommendation is at least one psychiatrist per 1 lakh population. So this overall scenario has resulted into several severe problems. And the next issue is the violation of the social contract. Because in this particular news item, where do we find the role of the government? Is government doing enough to protect its citizens? Is the government abiding by the social contract? Under the social contract, we have surrendered our certain rights to the government so that the government will be able to take better decisions, the government will be able to provide us a better security. But is the government doing enough to prevent this particular issue? So that is why the violation of the social contract is also one of the most important ethical issues. So this topic today we have taken so that you people also while reading the newspapers can come up with your independent ethical perspectives also which are related to certain news items. This will help you in your GS4 paper, that is of ethics. So that was all for today. All the very best and study hard.